Hello, welcome to MFP Live. I'm Donna Ladd, the editor of the Mississippi Free Press, and I'm here tonight with Kimberly Griffin, who is the publisher of the Mississippi Free Press and the co-founder. And we are thrilled tonight to have a very special guest, Michelle Duster, who is an author and a number of other things that I think she'll tell us about. But she recently published a book about her fabulous great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells. Welcome, Michelle. We're so glad to have you.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is such an honor.
So you're calling in from Chicago tonight, right? Is that where you are?
Yes, I'm live from Chicago.
So Kimberly, why don't you kick in and get us started?
So first, tell us a little bit about you, Michelle. More than a descendant of an amazing woman, clearly, what should folks know about you?
Well, I'm a writer, an editor, a professor, public historian. I've been involved in numerous projects that are focused on telling the story of African Americans and women in public spaces to help people learn outside of the school situation.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that.
And then for viewers who are unfamiliar with your amazing great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, give us a summary of what people should know who don't know that much about her, and who she is to you, and what makes her a real American hero, such as you depicted in this amazing book that you have out about her right now.
Thank you. My great-grandmother was Ida B. Wells. She was born in 1862, enslaved in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Luckily, the Civil War ended when she was only 3 years old in 1865. And she was a journalist, a civil rights activist, a suffragist, a social worker, a co-founder of the NAACP. She was a co-founder of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. She co-founded the Negro Fellowship League. She was involved in numerous activities that were about social justice, equality, and freedom for all American citizens.
Well, I can tell you, I've been a longtime fan and inspired. I mean, the fact that she was born in Mississippi alone is so vital, but inspired by her work as a journalist. And a muckraking journalist, who was really in the thick of so many issues at such a pivotal time in our history. And I did want to say a little bit about the book before we get too much further into this. I've been kind of devouring your book, and I was excited about reading the book. But what I didn't understand until I physically had it in my hands is how gorgeous of a book it is. I mean, I knew it had this great cover, but once I kind of got into the book and all of the decisions that y'all made about this book, the visuals, the showing documents of all sorts that around her work, and the controversies and the legalities, gorgeous pictures of other civil rights leaders, but also, early racial freedom workers, all sorts of intellectuals. So my question for you is, why did you decide to do this book the way it's done, and so visual and tactile? Talk a little bit about that.
Right. So one of the things that I was trying to go for with Ida B. the Queen was to tell the story of my great-grandmother's life and her legacy and the work that she did. I wanted to contextualize the time that she lived in, the struggles that she was involved in, that she faced, and what she was fighting for, freedom, justice, and equality for African Americans and women. She lived during a very violent time during our country's history. There was a mob rule. She was telling the truth about what was going on regarding lynching, which was obviously very violent. And so it's a very tough topic for people to read about. And to comprehend what our country was at that time. And so it felt needed to kind of counterbalance that tough information with visuals that are beautiful and eye-catching. And so the book is appropriate for all age groups.
Well, I was going to say, before I kick it back to Kimberly, I am ordering this book for both of my nieces who are college age. And because it just struck me, not that they wouldn't necessarily read a less visual biography, but that they will definitely read this book because I just think that they would be so enamored with everything about it and the way it looks. So that's happening.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Kimberly.
So I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, and I grew up in the 70s and 80s and went to public schools, raised by educators, went to predominantly Black schools. And I really like to think of it as a golden age for public education for Black folks in at least central Mississippi, because we learned a lot of Black history. It wasn't a month thing. It was an everyday thing. And so I feel like, in turn, I ended up being a huge history buff. So in turn, I didn't know about your great-grandmother until I was well into my 20s. Is that a story you hear often? And do you think is it because she was a woman, and B, because there is this eraser of Black history, even among Black folks? They don't realize that history's been erased. There's some people you just can't erase because they're omnipresent, like Medgar Evers was everywhere when I was a child. People still remembered. Do you hear that story a lot?
Unfortunately, I hear it more often than I would like. I mean, it's disappointing when I hear that people never heard of my great-grandmother until they were in their 20s or graduate school in their PhD program. I mean, just well into their education journey. And I feel like that is a shame when it comes to them as individuals, but also it reflects on our values as a country when it comes to, who is included and who is excluded, who is marginalized and who is centered when it comes to our country's history, our country's story. And I think not only about my great-grandmother being omitted in too many situations, but so many of her contemporaries, and then obviously people who came before her and after her. And that was one of the reasons why I really wanted to include the full spectrum of the African American experience in my book to show, to help people know my great-grandmother's story, but also to understand how she fits into our country's 400-year continuum of the African American experience of Black progress, but also backlash against our progress, and how what is happening today is connected to the past. And that also, my great-grandmother did not grow up in a bubble. She didn't grow up by herself. She was surrounded by people. She was part of a society and a culture that obviously had an impact on her.
I'm going to follow up with what Donna said about this book. It is beautiful, and I would love to know if I can buy a print of cover or something. But one thing that struck me is I could hand a young person this book, and it would send them in all areas of the Black American experience over the last 2 centuries. Like, it could be their launching point that, for them to learn so much. You're using current day folks, you're using your great-grandmother's contemporaries. Every era of the fight is represented here. And so I was really struck by that. The other thing that struck me, and you may speak more about that, do you find that Black history is included more in public schools? I'm not talking about college or graduate school or excluded more? Are you hearing more about your grandmother, or are you hearing that they're not getting this information?
I mean, I think, you know, the way that our country is set up is that school districts are run by local local school officials. And so, you know, in certain school districts, there might be more focus on inclusion when it comes to not only my great-grandmother, but stories of other African Americans as well as other people of color and women. But then, you know, we hear today, right now in 2021, of you know, school districts that are pushing back on even the suggestion of including more. I've read stories about, you know, some school districts that don't want to even acknowledge Black History Month. You know, so, you know, unfortunately, we do have, unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, you know, most school districts are run at the local level. So there is no, you know, national kind of, you know, oversight or push to have certain things included in local curriculum.
Right. So one of the first moments that I realized I didn't know enough about your great-grandmother, I was watching Iron-Jawed Angels, which is a movie about the American suffrage movement. And it was that scene where they wouldn't let her be in the parade. And I remember thinking, I don't know anything about the scope of her work. Like, I think of her as a newspaper woman. This is what I think of her as. But she was so much more than that. Her role in women's suffrage battles, including over the inequities between white women and Black women. We love the story of her being relegated to the back of the big march in NYC, but you'll see it's on the screen. But her then showing up at the front of the line.
Sneaking in.
I love everything about that story. I love her nodding and saying, oh yeah, I agree. Yeah, sure. Great. Her battles there are a great chance to educate us about racism within the suffrage movement. Can you talk a little more about that and what she encountered?
Right. Well, I mean, I can talk about what she wrote about.
Right.
And it's interesting when you read her writing, what she decided to focus on more and what she kind of glossed over. And so I, you know, had to kind of put the pieces together from other sources regarding her, not just her, but Black women's experience in the suffrage movement, which was, you know, and also one thing to keep in mind is that it was different depending on where people were located. And my great-grandmother was living in Illinois for a good portion of her involvement in the suffrage movement. In Illinois, but her experience was that she worked with white women on two different organizations that were in the city fighting for suffrage. And so she had an interracial experience in Illinois. But then she decided to found her own organization, the Alpha Suffrage Club, in 1913 when there was a feeling that the state of Illinois was on the cusp of giving, well, if you want to say giving, women the right to vote. And we all have to remember, and I think a lot of people are not familiar with the fact that suffrage was granted on a state-by-state basis. And I compare it to today's world where same-sex marriage was the same way. You know, you went one state at a time. And so that's how things were back in the 1800s to the early 1900s when it came to women gaining the right to vote. So the experience that my great-grandmother had might have been different than some other women depending on what state they were in. But her experience was that she worked with white women in Illinois. In fact, two women helped her found the Suffrage Club. And she traveled to Washington, D.C. To participate in the suffrage march with the Illinois delegation. She was representing the Alpha Suffrage Club. And so once they got there, And the organizers of the march asked the Black women to march in the back of the parade. Based on what I've read, through documents, even the women in the Illinois delegation were not happy with that request, and they were trying to figure ways around it. So my great-grandmother seemed to have a fairly positive interaction with white women in Illinois. But, nationally, that might not have been the case.
Well, personally, when I read that story, of her coming out of the crowd and then just taking her place at the front, I mean, I'm just cheering, as I'm reading the story, because that was just it. And then everyone acted like she was supposed to be there, it seemed like, and she's right there in the front. And so it was just this wonderful example of just doing it, just stepping up and taking her place. And that was a great story.
I just want to say that one of the things that I found when I was doing the research for I to Be the Queen was paying attention to what my great-grandmother decided to write about and what she decided to gloss over or not mention. And that is one of the things she chose to not mention, which I found that to be very interesting. It almost, I can surmise that maybe she didn't think it was that big of a deal. It's just another day in her life of, just agitating. So there were other sources that I had to rely on in order to even learn about that story of her, defying this request for Black women to march in the back of the parade. And it was reminiscent. One of the things that I compared it to in the book was how she refused to leave the ladies' car in the 1880s in Memphis, Tennessee. So that was the second time in her life at the parade. That was the second time in her life that she was defying a request for Black women to be in a second-class position.
Were there other things that you discovered that you were surprised that she didn't lift up more herself in her own writings?
I mean, a lot of the things that she did later in her life, she kind of summarized. And maybe, I don't know. I mean, I can only guess that for some reason she was like, yeah, that's no big deal. All I did was this, And she really didn't give a lot of details about her childhood either. That was very summarized in her autobiography. So, we can only, I did, even though she's my great-grandmother, I did have to do research in order to write this book to kind of fill in the gaps of what she did not give a lot of details about.
Right. And then when you talk about suffrage and we talk about the things that we all grow up not knowing or knowing, I mean, it's no surprise to you that here in Mississippi, not that it's the only place, but it's very dramatic how much of our history is kept from us, right? And I think one of the things that Kimberly and I are really trying to do in the Mississippi Free Press is to embed history, this kind of history every chance that we can get, so that we can kind of widen our, everyone's views and understand the things that happened. And one of the kind of discoveries that I think I've made in some of my own historic research was just this. What am I trying to say? So, that suffrage was complicated, not just in the fact that there were racist white women who were part of the suffrage movement, which when you think back on it seems obvious that would have been true too, but also I've run into things where there were, for instance, a white, the white man who was the first president of Mississippi State University here, a Confederate officer, former Confederate officer, et cetera, supported women's suffrage as he wrote, because they needed more white women to vote to even out votes of Black men who were getting the right to vote after emancipation. And we have the same thing, like they love here to brag about property rights, that women got property rights so early. Well, there were reasons that white women were getting property rights in the state of Mississippi. So I guess I'm saying I think suffrage itself is a far more complicated, layers of the onion issue than, we women, particularly white women, but probably a lot of women growing up have even thought about. And so I think her, Ida B. Wells' story really kind of complicates that narrative, which, I really appreciate. Have you run into stories that reminds you of that, as far as like that kind of that intersection that I'm talking about, of support for suffrage, but because of other reasons, beyond just giving women the right to vote?
Well, in my great-grandmother's autobiography, she did write about, she knew Susan B. Anthony, and they interacted a few times. So it's interesting because according to what she wrote in her autobiography, my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, obviously she thought that women should have the right to vote. But she also wrote about how she wasn't convinced that women gaining the right to vote would change laws or policies as much as one would hope if white women were voting in the same way as white men.
Right.
So she didn't have a lot of trust that things would change based on white women voting. And that struck me as interesting when you consider, the 2020 presidential election, the breakdown on how people voted, when you have more than half of white women voted for somebody who was made it no secret that he had, negative attitudes about people of color. So I think, her concerns have panned out, 100 years later.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree with you. Kimberly? Turn on mic.
Okay, sorry.
There you go.
So your great grandmother encountered resistance on every front. Todd put up on screen Negro agitator, which I think I must have a shirt. I must have all, and I want to be known as that. That was an amazing, and that continued up until from her time until now. There are these FBI and national government reports about Black people being agitators because they want what is fair. She was fighting for the rights of Black people and Black women, and repeatedly white women and Black men wanted her to temper her response or not include her response. What did you find over the course? How did she handle that? What did she do?
Based on what I read, she ignored it. She just kept going. I mean, she was disappointed. And that's one of the things I really hope comes across in my book, because I was very intentional about including, the reality that she did, get discouraged at times, and she was not sure about how to, where to go to the next step, and, felt, disappointment at times. And so I wanted to humanize her, and in that way make her relatable to people today, to understand that, yes, she did all of these things, and obviously they were awe-inspiring accomplishments that she achieved in one lifetime, but she also was human, and she had moments of doubt. And so, one can conclude by the fact that she did have low moments or questioning herself, but then she continued on. She didn't stop, and she could have stopped.
Mm-hmm.
She could have stopped at numerous points. Maybe when people threatened her, maybe when they, destroyed her printing press, after she kept writing about the realities of lynching and encouraging people in Memphis to boycott white-owned businesses and boycott the streetcars and leave Memphis if they could, after 3 of her friends were killed, basically because they were successful while Black. They owned a grocery store. There were 3 men who owned a grocery store that rivaled a white-owned grocery store. And what really happened, if we just want to summarize it, is that they were killed in order to eliminate the competition. Things were set up so that they were attacked, and then they defended themselves, and so the whole narrative was turned around as them being the aggressors. And so my great grandmother wrote about this, and she defied the narrative of them being the aggressors and sort of the criminalization of Blackness that we are still dealing with today. And so because she was a threat, to the status quo, to the social hierarchy, that was obviously the goal of all of this racial terrorism. And that's why she, even by the FBI, was considered to be a dangerous Negro agitator, because she was she was encouraging people to stand up for their rights and encouraging people to use whatever tools they had, which a lot of times were economic. I mean, she advocated for boycotts. I mean, that's one way to use economic power. So she was so effective at it that numerous people felt that they needed to silence her or somehow get rid of her.
Well, the story that you told, or that you tell in your book about Camp Logan in Texas, but how I'd love you to just kind of summarize that story a little bit. This is a story I didn't know, and so I was really struck by it in that sense. But also how she was threatened because of her support of those soldiers. I think it really ties to what you're already saying. So could you talk just kind of tell people a little bit about what happened at Camp Logan and her response to it?
Right. Well, like you said, I mean, I was very deliberate about starting the book that way, because I personally found that situation to be fascinating, and on so many levels, not only what my great grandmother did, but how the government responded and what does it say about our country. And so what happened was that there were some Black soldiers. This is during World War I. This was in 1917. There were some Black soldiers who were transferred from New Mexico to Camp Logan right outside of Houston, in order to be involved with the camp. And so white soldiers and white citizens of Houston resented their presence, and the soldiers resented being treated like second-class citizens when they were supposedly going overseas to fight for freedom and democracy in another country. But in their own country, they were treated with a lot of disrespect. And so tensions rose, and ultimately a riot broke out, and the Black soldiers were court-martialed. Several of them were hanged. Others received very long prison sentences. And my great-grandmother heard about that story, and she was mortified that the United States government would execute its own soldiers. And she decided to create a memorial service in their honor. And long story short, she was visited by what she called Secret Service agents in her book, but I know now 100 years later they were FBI, and they questioned her. She had created some buttons that said "Murdered Negro Soldiers," and for that she was threatened with treason because they considered her to be criticizing the government.
That and it reminds me, one of the things I've been doing is kind of studying kind of individual lynchings and racial violence in Mississippi. And I haven't found a county yet where there aren't documented cases. And there's so much, I think, I don't know, there's so much, I was thinking about this as I was reading your book, but there's so much about lynchings that I think as a practice and the purposes for it that so many people don't understand, that they think, oh, that was just those crazy, you know, I always call it the crazy clucker in the corner syndrome. Oh, that was those people. That wasn't our family, or that wasn't, you know, those were the crazy, awful people over there. And that's just not true. You know, the thousands of mostly men, rounding them up, but then lots of women and children would show up for these lynching events that were publicized in newspapers. There's one here in Ellisville, Mississippi, where, you know, the Jackson Daily News is huge headline that this lynching is going to happen later today, and gave the time. You know, I mean, those stories, and that's not unusual stories, right? And like I said to people, Todd and I, my partner, road trip to Louisville, Mississippi last weekend. That's a little town, Winston County, 30, 40 miles north of Neshoba County, where I'm from, which obviously had a very famous lynching. But up in Louisville, you know, I'm reading about, there are 11 documented known lynchings. And then most of them, as we now can tell from newspapers.com, were written about in detail by local newspapers, because apparently that was selling the newspapers. I mean, it's almost overwhelming to start diving in and really understanding right here in Mississippi, but not just in Mississippi and not just in the South, how it's worse here, you know, but how prevalent this was, and against soldiers. That's the story, you know, that one that we just were learning about was a 18-year-old soldier had come back from World War I, just not far from here, and was lynched just because of the way he talked to someone. I know this isn't a surprise, but it is to a lot of people, right? Because they just don't know. So, you know, so I guess the question that's up in there somewhere is, you know, what she was clearly doing when I started reading deeper about your great grandmother, is that she was trying to raise that awareness, right, everywhere, trying to get, you know, lynching laws, trying to get that recognition, but also I think trying to get America to recognize the humanity or the inhumanity of what was actually happening here. I don't know. What would you like to say about that? It's not really a question, but.
I mean, I think she was trying to do both of what you said. I think she was trying to highlight the inhumanity of the barbarity, the barbarism that was going on regarding lynching was not, you know, this act of when I was a kid, I thought lynching was what I saw in the Western movies, where somebody would be on a platform and they place the rope around that person, and then the floor would drop out, which is obviously horrible anyway. But the lynchings that were taking place during my great grandmother's time were way more violent than that, and I was mortified when I read accounts and saw photos of lynchings. I have worked on a few projects before I wrote this book, and so I have seen a lot of primary documents of lynchings, and like you said, the newspaper headlines and the ways that the newspaper articles chronicled the lynchings in great detail. And actually, that was one of the techniques that my great-grandmother used in her writing. She quoted some other newspapers to make her point, and she would scour other newspapers and extract information from them in order to sort of build her case, and that was what is now known as data journalism.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote, names, dates, locations, circumstances of the different lynchings, but I think most people today have no idea how brutal and just barbaric a lot of the lynchings were, and how you were mentioned how complicit the newspapers were in actually promoting this and making it into almost like an entertainment kind of atmosphere, where people, and then even the public transportation systems were involved, because there were times when they sold discounted tickets on the train for people to come to watch the lynching, and have special train routes or added trains in order to bring people to this. So there were so many different systems and organizations that were involved in all of this, and that's one of the things that my great-grandmother absolutely chronicled. And when people can read the primary documents of her writing, they can learn all of those details. Mm-hmm. My goal with my book was to summarize and introduce people to this information, but there are a lot of, she left a trail of primaries, of what would be considered primary sources by today's world, of excruciatingly detailed information. I'll just give one example, and I summarized it in the book when she talked about the riot that took place in Elaine, Arkansas in 1919. And this is something that, all of us who are alive today, really, I think we need to think about this, the remnants or the ramifications of these destruction of entire communities. Mm-hmm. And she chronicled the actual economic value of the loss of people's land being stolen, and their property being destroyed, and just the level of terror. Hundreds of people were killed, and she chronicled that with several different riots that took place. What she was doing almost can be used for primary sources today. Mm-hmm. When it comes to arguments about reparations, because it was so specific on the level of loss that was documented by her.
Well, and what you're saying, I think, is, and Ellen Ann Fentress had put up a comment that was similar to this, but it's so important to break through, I think, to people, and that racial violence right here in Mississippi, and beyond, but was intentional. And there were, as I know but there were 2 Mississippi plans. And the first Mississippi plan after emancipation was violence straight up. And so a lot of these race massacres that happened then, and they were massacres. Mm-hmm. Vicksburg, was one. There were, we've been visiting some of the towns and the spaces where the massacres happened, and they were terrible. And massacre is an intentional word, because they were killing just people because someone, like in Vicksburg, I think it was over a black man who had become a deputy, or I'm not going to get the exact details right, but it was a power thing, right? And so the Mississippi plan was very intentional in the sense of, we're going to have these the Klan, but all these other groups too, not just the Klan, go around and commit this violence. And then it was, and then that went forward. And so many of the lynchings and or race massacres of whole groups or towns or communities destroyed potential wealth, much less, human life, for generations. And so I think that's that's exactly what you're getting into. But then even today, you were quoted in our story that Christian Middleton did about the lynching memorial at the University of Mississippi, and about that the white board of supervisors, all white male board of supervisors in Lafayette County, still makes no sense, but didn't want to memorialize one of the Black men who was killed on the marker that they are doing there, because he was accused of killing a white woman. Which, I'll let you respond to that, and what maybe Ida B. Wells said about the excuse of that was constantly used of dishonoring or killing or raping or whatever of white women. I would love to hear that, what you would say to that.
Well, my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, was motivated to expose the truth about what was going on regarding lynching after 3 of her friends were killed. And the common narrative at that time was that Black men were violating white women. So, this violence that was taking place mostly against Black men was framed as a way of sort of protecting white women or white women's virtue. And so my great-grandmother pointed out with her friend's situation that none of those men were guilty of that kind of crime at all. In fact, they were guilty of no crime. And they were actually upstanding citizens, leaders in the community. They were enterprising men who had a successful business, a grocery store. And so she was propelled to put 2 and 2 together. And actually today, she is considered to be a pioneer when it comes to sociology, because what she was doing was she investigated other lynchings that took place. And time again, she found that the people who were lynched were not guilty of that kind of crime. And if there were any liaisons that really did happen between Black women and white men, the opposite, Black men and white women, that most of the time it was consensual, which was a horrifying thought for white men to even consider at that time. And then she also pointed out the hypocrisy of this whole dynamic, because, when it comes to Black women being violated by white men, and who is protecting Black women, and so she really sort of, just blew the whole sort of narrative out of the water when it comes to white women are protected by murdering Black men, but then Black women have zero protection. And so when it comes to womanhood, and she kind of intertwined this whole argument, if you're protecting women, then why aren't Black women protected? And that was one of the reasons why she sued the Chesapeake, Ohio and Southwestern Railroad, because she was a woman riding in the ladies' car and asked to move to the colored car, which doubled as a smoking car. So then it's like, well, at what point am I considered to be a woman? So she was fighting multiple battles, all at the same time, as a Black woman living in a patriarchal, racist society.
This has been a tough. Donna's the journalist. I'm not. A decade for journalists. Their work has been minimized, laughed at, trifled with. Good journalism is seen as elitist and something that is not helpful for the community. Journalism is mocked in every corner, coupled with the fact that we have big tech taking us down kind of at every corner. And one of the things that Donna always says is there is this fallacy of fairness isn't the word. What's the word you use, Donna?
Well, false balance.
Balance, where if you go talk to the president of the NAACP, you must go talk to the president of the Ku Klux Klan. So
We've seen those stories here.
it's not a joke. The other day I was listening to critics talking about a recent documentary about a famous and very wealthy abuser. And one of the critics said, well, I just had a problem with the fact that they didn't tell his side of the story when we've heard his side of the story for probably 30 years at this point. We know his side of the story. He's had the pulpit. So what would you say is the lesson that Ida B. Wells gave journalism in terms of social activism and muckraking and things that matter?
Well, I mean, I think we need to consider the fact that my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, lived during a time when women did not have the right to vote for most of her life. Women did not have very many opportunities to own property. And so there were a lot of barriers for women, specifically, obviously for Black women even more. And so, the only tool she really had was the truth. And she really ultimately, in my opinion, was an optimist who believed that if people knew the truth, then that could somehow affect change. And so she was really focused and determined to document factual information that nobody could argue about, and she used other people's writings a lot of times to as the sources, so then they couldn't say, well, she was making this up. I mean, what she was doing was equivalent to today of capturing a screenshot of somebody's tweet and then inserting it into her story. And so they could never say, I didn't say that. And so that's what she was doing. And she was masterful at using people's words against them in a way that they couldn't argue that they said it. And so if you really study the way that the techniques that she used, then she was letting people indict themselves and almost painting them into a corner so they couldn't deny anything. She did this so many times. I mean, there's one example with I know I might be kind of going off with the lynching thing.
I love it. No.
Masterful what she did with Frances Willard, for instance, who was the president of the Temperance Organization. Frances Willard had made some really derogatory remarks when it came to Black men. When Ida had asked her if she could, use her platform to amplify the issue when it came to lynching. And Frances Willard gave an interview and where she made some very disparaging remarks about Black men being dangerous and whatever she said that was very disparaging. And Ida clipped out the article that was written in another magazine. And when she was asked about her opinion about Frances Willard, she didn't say. She just pulled out the magazine article, the newspaper article, and read the actual words that Frances Willard said. And Frances Willard was right next to her. And she was like, this is what she said. And she couldn't deny that she said it because she actually said it and it was in print. So it wasn't Ida making this up. And she did that over and over again, where she would use people's words, what they said, in a way they couldn't deny it. So then they have to figure out how to explain themselves, like this is what they didn't, this isn't what they meant, or whatever kind of way they would try to weasel their way out. So the only thing she had, in my opinion, as a tool was the truth. Mm-hmm. And she was almost like surgical precision when it came to what information she would include and how she would include it, and in a way that could not be denied. And she was using it in a way that would influence people who did have power to put pressure on systems in order to affect change.
Everything you just said, that's it, and not being afraid of power, but at the same time trying to influence it by bringing the receipts and by holding people accountable, right? And not really caring if they're uncomfortable with it, right? It's in creating discomfort in somebody who was just sitting right next to her because of what they had said in the past. I mean, that's.
I think that my great-grandmother, I'm surmising based on how focused she was. I truly believe that she looked at this as a life and death situation. This was not a game, and people were dying, and her life was threatened, and so she didn't care if people's feelings were hurt, if it meant that somebody's life could be changed, could be spared. Who cares about if you're upset that I, didn't agree with you? I mean, literally thousands of people are being killed.
Right, exactly. And, and I know as a newspaper editor that makes people uncomfortable with some of the things, let's say the emails series or whatever from the University of Mississippi. I mean, I hear stories of even editors at other publications, asking for me not to be on a panel with them, and I'm not Ida B. Wells, but you know what I mean? Because, she might criticize us. And it's just this idea that this fragility, that is just kind of astonishing. But I think there's so many things I admire her for, but I think what you're talking about right now is probably at the heart of it, because I hear what you're saying. It was, and it is life or death to talk about so many of the accountability things that need to be talked about, whether it's police violence or so many other things in today's world. So yeah, that speaks to me, I'll tell you. So I wanted to ask you a little bit, just to see if we don't have much more time, but to see if you, if there's, there had been this effort, and I know you wrote about it recently, I think in the Daily Beast, but there had been an effort to try to rename the journalism school at the University of Mississippi after Ida B. Wells. And, that didn't work out. And I'm wondering what you would say about that to the people who are listening now, about what happened with that.
This was in 2018. There was an effort on the part of students and faculty and staff to have the Ed Meek School of Journalism and New Media renamed in Ida B. Wells' honor after there was a big controversy regarding Ed Meek. And so I was contacted to ask how our family felt about it. And considering the fact that my great-grandmother was born in Holly Springs, which is not very far away from Oxford, Mississippi, so she, is a native, Mississippian, and the University of Mississippi is the flagship public school in the state. So it seemed like it would be fitting. And on top of that, obviously, she's one of the most well-known and pioneering journalists in our country's history. So why wouldn't the school want to be named after somebody who was such a trailblazer in the field? But there were a lot of different opinions about what was going on the campus, and different people's opinions about who should be honored, and the dynamics of all of the things that the different sort of camps of opinions on the school campus. Things kind of got tabled for a while, and so that didn't happen. The change didn't happen, and then it kind of resurfaced a little bit last year, and still didn't really get too far. So that was disappointing. I understand the whole dynamics. I live in this society, and I understand the whole dynamics of when it comes to economics and power, and entities that have vested interests in certain areas. But there is a point in time as a society when I think we need to decide, does money mean more than integrity?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm on the record, as you know, as thinking that they still should rename the journalism school after Ida B. Wells. And I think you said to me at one point, maybe in Twitter or something, that, you've kind of moved on from the issue or something like that. But I do feel like, that they should do that. But then if they rename it the school after her, they also need to live up to that as well. I think, with it would the way I look at it is it would set a very high standard of truth telling in journalism. And it would, I'm with you. It seemed to make a whole lot of sense.
Well, I mean, my opinion is that there's one thing to have a symbolic change.
Mm-hmm.
And we can look at that when it came to some of the logos that were recently changed for some brands, that came under fire, right? And so, okay, you can have a logo change or you can have an image change, but does it change the culture?
Mm-hmm.
And so, at some point, it's like, well, yes, it would be great for my great-grandmother's, to be honored with the naming. But if the culture doesn't change, then it's not really honoring her.
Exactly. Kimberly, did you have any last thing you want to jump in there with?
I just wanted to, I feel like we've hit a couple of different points that I want to encapsulate. There's a continuing genocide against African Americans, Black folks in the diaspora. And I think it just changes shape. So when your great-grandmother was alive, it was overt. Right now, I think it's covert because I call it the charm offensive. So we will pull the best and the brightest out of the African American community with money, with disenfranchising them from HBCUs, with making our standards more appealing. We have using colonized ways of thinking, and we tell people it's the respectability politics, right? This is what makes you a respectable person, not the way that you believe makes you a respectable person. And you will be rewarded with wealth, or you will be rewarded with a good education if you follow our rules. So it's interesting to see how that changes, because I can code switch. I can move across communities, but my grandparents didn't have that opportunity. My great-grandparents didn't have that opportunity. And now that we have that opportunity, it's being used against us to create a different kind of massacre or a genocide or attack on us. There's no question. It was just me thinking about all the points of it's the same thing happening. It just has a different name.
Yeah.
There's a vested interest that certain groups of people have in this country to maintain things the way that they have been, from a patriarchal and racial hierarchy. And this sort of zero-sum game attitude that some people seem to have, that if somebody else gets something, then that means they lose. And so when people do have that attitude, then then it's sort of understandable how they would have this fear of anybody else having anything besides them, because they do look at it that way. But I mean, it is a struggle to help people understand that the pie is big enough for everybody, and it actually tastes better, with more flavor. So. We just have growing pains in our country to sort of deal with people who are fearful of something that they don't really understand, and they are, unfortunately, I think our country is fragmented when it comes to media messages, and people, we don't even agree on what the truth is, and that makes it really difficult to solve problems.
That's right. Well, Michelle, this has been a real honor to talk to you tonight. We know you're in a busy book tour, and we really appreciate you giving us a full hour to talk about the remarkable Ida B. Wells. I do want to encourage everybody to go buy this book and buy it for people, because it's a gorgeous book and it's a perfect gift. And thank you so much. I hope this sells and sells and sells, because so many people need to know more about your great-grandmother and to learn the lessons that she left for all of us. We appreciate you. We appreciate her. And we thank you so much for being here with us tonight.